This is a response to a comment made by a user, I think called Edward Seif, something like that. It was a comment you left there on my video about art must be beautiful, where you asked me, you know, basically, does art have to be beautiful? Does art have to have something to do with beauty? And secondarily, you know, what is my understanding of a term? Sorry about that. What is my understanding of a term like beauty? And what is my definition of beauty, I guess? I did start to try to answer those in comment form, but it seemed like I was going to spend more than 150 characters or whatever it is, so I thought I'd better make a video. Yeah, for the second bit first, about this thing about, I mean, it is fascinating, this thing about beauty, because I'm really captured by that phrase. I can't remember who said this phrase, by the way, but a phrase I read somewhere, that beauty, it says beauty is the promise of function, which, you know, it's in a sense it's a ridiculous reduction, but at the same time I really like it, just because of its, partly because of its simplicity, but also because of its appeal to a kind of biological naturalism or something, or a functionalism. Beauty is the promise of function, and my interpretation of that, which I think is probably about right, is that you know, these experiences that we have, not so much aesthetic experiences, although they're clearly part of it, but the experiences we have in the wide world, you know, where you see a beautiful landscape, or you see a beautiful person, a member of the opposite sex possibly, or you see a beautiful beautiful weather pattern, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. If you see something like that and you have this experience, this felt sense of something that you might call an appreciation of beauty, then the logic goes that that's happening for a reason, an evolutionary adaptive reason. I did warn you this is going to be reductive, and so we're experiencing that beauty because it's telling us something about our relationship to the world, in the same way that, you know, a beautiful taste, maybe I'll think of a beautiful taste, but in the same way that something that tastes good, historically at least, has been an indicator that substance is nutritious. I mean, that's not the case anymore, of course. McDonald's burgers taste good, so I'm told, but they're not good for us. But certainly historically, the things that have tasted good are the things that have contained fats and sugars, naturally occurring fats and sugars, and those are the things that our bodies needed in the past. So our tastes, in that case our literal taste, has been in lockstep with the nutritional demands of our body, ultimately driven by the prerogatives of an entity that's trying to survive and reproduce. And I suppose the same thing is true of beauty. You know, that obviously those are that's the taste cue, but beauty is usually a visual cue to something that has the same potentials to enhance our possibilities for survival and reproduction, so the idea goes. So a beautiful landscape is accounted for as being beautiful, as producing that sense, because typically those are the kinds of landscapes which, to our forebears at least, would have offered the best chance of survival. They're typically the things that we, and I think there's quite a bit of universality about this. The landscapes that humans typically find beautiful are usually ones that have the possibility of shelter. They've usually got running water. They've usually got things growing in them, plants and possibly animals surviving in that landscape already. It's usually a landscape which isn't kind of weathered and battered and doesn't have evidence of storms and so on it. And here, by the way, I'm distinguishing beautiful and sublime. The sublime is a bit different. You know, the kinds of landscapes you would find in calendars and chocolate boxes, that kind of thing. It appeals, and it has mass appeal, because it's appealing to a relatively universal sense of the kind of landscape that would support us. That's the theory. And the same thing with, of course, members of the opposite sex, and of course it's really controversial here, but the idea is that let's say feminine beauty this is so interesting. The idea is that feminine beauty, or the signifiers of feminine beauty, are those features of the female body which suggest fecundity and fertility and perhaps even availability. I mean, I know there's lots of critiques of that and they're completely valid, but that's the idea, that beauty is the promise of function. So the promise of the function of a landscape is that you will use it to grow crops, to hunt animals, to hunt and gather and shelter, and the promise of the beauty of a member of the opposite sex is the possibility that you might bounce their bones. That's the idea. Yeah, so it's a kind of affordance model, really. You know, you're looking at the landscape in terms of what it will afford, or you're looking at another member of the human race as to what they will afford in terms of their opportunities for reproduction or whatever. So that's something. I don't know what if that really how that really plays itself out in terms of the aesthetics of art. You know, I sometimes think that art, in that sense, is serving at least, you know, the classic aesthetic models of art. The things that Nicotine 2 talked about, you know, kind of high-end art that pushes those aesthetic models to the limit, is something like it's doing like the same thing that McDonald's does actually. You know, McDonald's basically takes those simple functions of that our tastes have of appreciating salts and sugars and fats, and keeps pressing those buttons, doesn't it? You know, that's what McDonald's burgers do. They press those buttons so you're hyper-stimulated. Actually, I think Tinbergen did some of this kind of stuff with Tinbergen, the ethologist. He did some of this stuff with birds and animals, actually, that they could be hyper-stimulated in the same way. Ramachandran talks about that too. But the idea is that, you know, I think there's a case to be argued that the kind of art that is not necessarily populist, but popular in terms of its classical relationship to aesthetics, is art that presses those, that turns the button ups to 11. You know what I mean? It does that kind of thing with all those beauty responses. So the promise of the functionality of a Venus de Milo is hyper-functionality, hyper-sexuality. The promise of a landscape, a Gainsborough landscape, is hyper-functionality, hyper-affordance. Extremely livable in, extremely fuckable. I think there's an argument to be made for that. Okay. Second part of that really is to do with, a little bit into linguistics, actually. Because there's some interesting things I've been reading about beauty and linguistics, because linguistics doesn't do quite the same thing as philosophy. It doesn't try to get directly into the workings of knowledge or the mind or whatever. It focuses on the language, because, you know, language is a window into human nature, possibly, or it's just interesting in and of itself. And the way that something like beauty is represented in language is quite interesting, particularly how that representation varies across different languages. Because, for example, again, there's some universals here. You know, most people would, I think almost all, certainly all the countries, all the languages that have been studied, contain an association of their word for beauty with things like children, females, and flowers, I think is what I read. I'll check this, but I'm pretty sure that was what it was. You know, so it would be very common in most languages to say, you know, a beautiful woman, a beautiful flower, a beautiful baby. Well, you know, that would make perfect sense in almost all languages. But some languages have different abilities or representations of beauty. So, for example, in most languages, but not all, you can say beautiful weather. I mean, that's something you can say in English. You can say, sorry about this camera work. You can say the weather is beautiful in English, or it's gorgeous, or it's fair, or it's I don't know, that kind of lovely weather. And you can say that in a lot of other languages, but in some languages you can't say that. I think you can't say it in German, but I might be wrong. Or Russian. No, that's right. You can't say that in Russian. It doesn't make any sense. And conversely, there's some languages that you can use beauty as a descriptor for other concepts that you wouldn't use in English. So, for example, in Russian, no, not Russian, in German, I think it's right. You say Danke schön, which is a way of saying thank you, but it means beautiful thank you. Where we would in English we would say thank you very much. We would increase the size of our thank you. In German, they intensify it by making it more beautiful. So we would say Danke schön. I think that's true in Hungarian as well. Maybe Mark Almafarag, if you watch this video, you might be able to correct me on this one, but I'm pretty sure in Hungarian you intensify thank you by making it more beautiful. Beautiful thank yous. Which again you don't get in English and you don't get in Russian and other languages. I'm not quite sure it's got to do with the original point that you asked there, Edward Seath. Yeah, that's that. Okay, just this thing about art. Does art have to be beautiful? Well, I don't know, really. I mean, it certainly doesn't have to be visually beautiful. I mean, this is something I would really love to find out. Oh, sorry about the camera, I'm going round and roundabout. Ah! Here we go. I would love to find out. I mean, certainly art does not have to be visually beautiful. Obviously not. I mean, there was a time when that was thought to be the case, but no longer. Nor does music have to be beautiful, nor does literature have to be beautiful. But at least on the face of it. But I'd really like to know what's going on there behind the scenes, because one of the things I've kind of hinted at in other videos is that I do get a sense of beauty. I do get an aesthetic pleasure from certain artworks which visually are hideous. I've talked about Sarah Lucas's piece Bunny, for example, which is pretty gross and horrible to look at, and a crude representation of a female body, and just rubbish, really. But I do find it quite something beautiful about it. It's not the beauty of the object; it's the beauty of the idea, particularly in concert with the other ideas around it. In concert with the ideas around the history of art and contemporary art and so on. So there's a kind of conceptual beauty to that. I mean, what I'd really like to know is, what is the relationship between my aesthetic sense, produced by what I think is conceptual beauty, and those other things to do with beauty. I mean, because beauty in terms of functionality, in terms of those things I talked about before when I was talking about promise of function, beauty in terms of, let's say, a human face, usually correlates with things like symmetry and balance and averageness. You know what I mean? There's been tests done on this, that the most beautiful faces are symmetrical, but they're also the kind of most average. You know what I mean? Not a nose that's not too big, not too small, a chin that's not too round, not too pointy. It's very something like that. And so I do wonder if there's a correlate of things like that in the conceptual domain. So I just pulled up outside B&Q because I've got to buy some DIY stuff. I do wonder if there's a correlate to that in the conceptual domain. Whether we're saying if we're saying when we find ideas or concepts beautiful, like for example in certain bits of conceptual art, is there some kind of weird metaphorical analogy going on with things like symmetry, or things like balance, or things like averageness, or beauty drawn from other beautiful things, beautiful landscapes which suggest fecundity, or suggest shelter, or suggest safety, or suggest the presence of something we can eat. I don't know is the answer. Anyway, I've got to go and buy some stuff from B&Q now. Thanks very much for the comment, and I'm sorry my video response is so long.